Howdy guys. So in this short video we're going to go over a simple user interface overview and some common things that you may see me doing with the user interface in future videos that I want to make sure y'all are aware of before you get lost in later videos. And I'll still try my best to explain what I'm doing in future videos, but just in case I don't, we have this video. So this is what Houdini looks like when it's opened for the first time. If yours doesn't look like this, go up to this top gadget up here and select build from this list, and that should set it to look like my screen. Once you do that, let's go over the different windows that Houdini has. So this big open window right here is the scene view. This is where geometry, particles, the objects that you will be working with in Houdini, where they will appear on screen. Over here is the parameters view. This is where you can set the parameters that control the output for the objects that you see in the scene view. And we'll go over more of what messing with parameters in this video and some more in a future video. This bottom right hand corner area right here is the node view, node viewport. So in here, this is where we'll be creating the nodes that we will be using to work with all of the geometry. So let's check out some of the basic controls in the viewport real quick. So we can use the left mouse button to rotate the camera by just clicking and moving the mouse. We can use the right mouse button to zoom in and out with the camera by right-clicking and zooming in and out with the mouse. You can also use the middle mouse button by pushing in, if you have a scroll wheel, to pan the camera around. Scrolling in and out on the wheel will also zoom in and out the camera. So the viewport is broken up into these divider walls here, and we can click on them and drag them around to change all of the heights and locations. And we can also collapse them by selecting these little arrows on the sides. And we can expand them again by clicking on the opposite facing arrow. And you can do this to all of these windows with dividers. So if you accidentally click on one of these and the window collapses, don't panic, you can get it back. And you can do this to any of these windows up here. So almost everything that has one of these little arrow things is collapsible or expandable. In fact, I like to keep this top bar up here collapsed, because all of this bar is similar to the top bar in Maya. And if you're familiar with Maya, it can get really condensed, really dense and convoluted, and there's just a lot of stuff here. And I don't like having to click through and select things through windows, and Houdini has a really great way to just access all of this through other means that's a lot more accessible. So I just don't like using this at all, so I'm just going to shrink it and leave it. So when you don't see that in my future videos, that's why. Yeah. So all these dividers can click and move around like that. We can split these panes to make duplicates, or say we're working on two different things for whatever reason, and we want to reference something back and forth. We can do that by splitting the panes. To do that, hit Alt bracket, left bracket, and that will split the screen vertically, left and right. And we can split it again the other way with Alt right bracket. And we can delete these tabs by just Xing out the new pane that it makes, or by hitting Alt slash, and you can just keep doing this all day long and make as many as you want and delete as many as you want. It's pretty easy. And if you accidentally delete some of these, in order to get them back, we can just split the pane again and then this was our node view up here, and this was our parameter view, and this was our node view, but now our node view is up here. We can change this by right-clicking and going to parameters, and now this is back to our parameters view. And we could also add multiple tabs by just adding new tabs and working them through here. So let's start looking at some basic use in the node or network view. So going down here, we're going to hit tab, and it's going to bring up the tab menu. This is a menu of all of the basic types of nodes or parent nodes that we can add to interact with in Houdini. Almost exclusively in this class we're going to be using geometry nodes. So we're going to go down to geometry and just drop down a basic geometry node. And we'll just left click to drop it right there. So this is what the basic geometry node look like in Houdini. We can middle mouse click in this view to pan around in the viewport. We can right click and pan to zoom in and out. You can left click to select nodes and left click and drag to select multiple nodes with a marquee style selection. You'll notice when we hover over some nodes, we'll get this nice nifty radial menu out here. These radial buttons are new to Houdini 16. In previous versions of Houdini, it was left to these buttons on the sides of the nodes. And I'll go more over what those are in a future video. Let's say that we're working in a network and our node gets lost. Like we zoom out a lot and we pan out over a whole lot, and we've accidentally zoomed back in and we can't find nodes. Like even when you zoom out, it's tiny, hard to get back to. So we can just quickly view all nodes on screen by pressing H, and it will hop us back to displaying all nodes. Similarly, if we have a node selected and we press G, it will move us to the selected node. You'll notice in the bottom corner here, when I press H, the home all or G and home selected will appear to show you what you pressed. So now that we have some geometry to interact with in our viewport, let's take a look at some of the more simple viewport controls. So in our viewport, this is our geometry, and just like with the nodes, we can pan a lot and have the geometry go off screen, and it could get into a weird angle. H will put our viewport back to home and center the asset back on screen. And since we have geometry on screen, let's go ahead and go over some of the geometry visualizers that we'll use a lot more in future videos to help us interact with some of the geometry we've created in Houdini. So this nifty row of buttons over here are the geometry visualizers. They display extra information and make some information easier to read on our geometry. So we can turn this on to display points, and it will highlight all of the points or clusters of vertices on our geometry, so like points in Maya. Same, we can put this one on and it will display the point numbers. This point number is the order in which the points are drawn, starting at 0 in Houdini, and I'll explain the significance of point orders in probably the next video. This information is really helpful to have, using this point number information to modify and select different parts of the geometry. The same, just as with points, we can show the number for the primitives or the faces in our geometry. We can also display the primitive normals, and it will display these lines, the normal being the direction that the primitive face is facing. And just like how primitives have normals, points also have normals. So sometimes, and maybe this is the case for you, this information is really small and hard to see. or maybe we need to work in a different scale than what Houdini has by default. So we can actually change how large these point and normal visualizers are quite easily. So we're going to press D inside this viewport, and it's going to bring up our display options window, and we're going to go over to the guides tab, and over here in this bottom right hand corner we have guide sizes, and we can move the sliders to change the scale of here, so we can see the normal vector lines scaling. I like to keep my point marker size pretty large, so I usually leave it around 5. We can also change the font to make our numbers bigger and easier to see if we need to do so. Usually small or medium is fine for me, but you never know. So once you find something that you like, just hit save as default and hit OK, and the next time you open Houdini it should retain the settings that you had. And so let's close out of that, and let's look at how to interact with and move around some basic geometry. Just how escape is the hotkey to select the camera or the view controls. If we press enter while in our viewport, it will change us over to a geometry selection mode. So we can left click on some geometry and it will bring up this nifty handle to do some basic geometry interactions. So in this view we can click and drag to do basic translate and rotations on the handles, similar to what you would do in Maya. You'll notice that while I'm rotating and moving this box over here, these numbers over in our parameters view are changing. So I can actually change these numbers to modify the geometry just by typing in values. Similarly, I can middle mouse click to bring up this slider menu to step through the values. By middle mouse clicking and dragging, I can move it by the incremental value that is selected. So if I want to move it faster or larger amounts faster, I can have up to 1, or it can go down to a smaller one and then move with smaller increments. This is very common. We will be using this a lot, and this is on each one. Every single parameter has this capability, and on parameters that are vectorized parameters, so like we'll translate, we have X, Y, and Z translations. We can middle mouse click over all of them and it will change that value for all 3. So you'll notice when we have this geometry mode selected, we can't rotate or move around in our camera like we were doing before. So if you hold down the Alt button, it will temporarily bring you back to the camera controls while you are in geometry mode, and while holding Alt, all of the same camera controls, middle mouse click, right click to zoom in and out and pan, will all still work. So if we press E, it will bring up the scale menu. Selecting these arrows will do a uniform scale. It will scale each axis uniformly. If we want to scale an axis individually, we can select the axis handle on the inside and it will scale along that axis. This works for all axes. R is to rotate, and same, we can select the interior ones and it will rotate along the specific axis. This outer ring will allow us to rotate objects based on our camera perspective, which is sometimes incredibly useful given different circumstances. T is translate, and it will rotate by default, or it will translate by default according to the local object orientation. So this direction Y was originally the Y up translation for the object. But you'll notice if I just move Y up here, it goes straight up. So these are world transforms. These handles by default are in local transformations or object transformations. In order to change that, if we press the M key, it will realign our axes, our handle axes, to different relative transformations alignments. So by default it is local. If we hit M, it will change it to world transforms. And if we hit it again, it will set to parent transforms or viewport transforms. I like to just leave it in world or relative object transformations. So let's go ahead and zero out our asset real quick and hit escape to go back to our camera mode. So while we're in our viewport control, we have this nifty infinite grid going on here. We can toggle this off by displaying and toggling off this grid to display or hide the grid. In some cases I find it easier to work without a grid, and sometimes the grid is really useful, so it just depends on your workflow, whether you want the grid or not. So in the view controls, just like in Maya and other 3D programs, of course we can view the viewport in different perspective views. So pressing 2 will change our view to top view. Pressing 3 will change it to a front view. 4 will change it to the right view, and 1 is the default back to our perspective view. We can also change these using this drop-down menu here by selecting this perspective button and going to set view, and then these are the different viewports that you have that we can toggle through, and we can just play through those all day. We can also, just like we could to split all of our other panes, we can likewise split our view to display multiple views at once. So to do this, we can hit Control 2 to display 4. So this will display perspective, front, right, side, top, whatever you would like. Control 3 will split it horizontally up and down. Control 4 will split it vertically left and right, and Control 1 will bring us back to a single window view. And just as with the other option, we can change this with this menu up here, this little white box, and select a bunch of different views up there. But those are the ones we'll be using the most often. So after we've done all of this display, we've split, let's say I want to split this screen up here and get 2 views. I like this to be a lot bigger, 'cause maybe I'm working with a smaller geometry. Let's raise this up so I can get a better look at my nodes, and I've got my panel shrunk up there. So I've set it up like this, and this is how I like my Houdini view, and I'd like it to do this every time I open it, or at least be able to access this view quickly. In order to do this, we can actually save a custom build layout for Houdini. So let's go up to build and save our current desktop as something. So I'm going to save this as my desktop, and want save. And it has saved our view. So now you'll see instead of build, it says my desktop. I can change this back to build, and it's going to go back to how I had before. And let's say I reload my current desktop to its default settings. So this is what, again, by default opening Houdini will look like this. I can change it back to my desktop, and then it will open back right here. So when I have this selected, I can quickly, by opening Houdini, just move to the desktop that I would like to move to. Similarly, you could also, if you wanted, save over the build desktop by just saying save current desktop. Say I make a desktop or two and I'm through with them. We can do this by opening up the desktops manager, and here I have a list of all of my desktops and then options that I have available for them. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this desktop and apply changes and accept, and Houdini's going to freak out because I just deleted the active desktop display that I had, and so let's go back to build. And that's about it. So in the next video we're going to go over using some simple nodes and start manipulating some geometry in Houdini.